So I just want to welcome everybody who's here and say thank you very much for joining us today. This is the second day of the Bridget Festival Vancouver, and today we're joined by Chris Morrissey, and we will be telling the story of Bridget Coll, her life partner. So we begin every session with a territorial land acknowledgement. As is our practice in British Columbia, we begin by acknowledging the traditional territories where we live and work. I'd like to acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. So a little bit about the festival here in Vancouver. Bridget's Day heralds the return of spring and the time of rebirth. So on the Irish calendar and the Irish pagan calendar, tomorrow is the beginning of spring on the 1st of February and is St. Bridget's Day, or in the pagan, Imbolc. For the past 3 years, the Irish Benevolent Society of Vancouver has brought the Bridget Festival here in Vancouver, and has joined with over 35 Irish diplomatic missions and many other community groups from Washington to Moscow to honour Ireland's matriarchal saint. We welcome participants from around the world to celebrate the creativity of women, and the theme of this year's festival is Bridget, an avatar for the power of women. Some general housekeeping, this session is recorded and will be shared in the coming days on the Bridget Festival website, which is bridgetfestivalvancouver.com. If you have any questions and comments, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and this will be answered during our Q&A session at the end. The chat function is turned off for the participants to use and for us as panelists to view. So the Q&A section is where any comments or questions should be directed. Lastly, the Bridget Festival Vancouver is a volunteer-led event, and admission to all events is free. Donations to the Irish Benevolent Society are appreciated, however, and information on how to donate can be found on our website. And just on that very quickly, the Irish Benevolent Society donations for that go to the to running of Bridget Festival, as well as the Benevolent Fund, which assists Irish people in BC who find themselves in financial difficulty. So we have Chris Morrissey here today as our guest speaker, and we have recorded remarks from Dr. Maurice Casey, who unfortunately couldn't be here from Ireland due to the ongoing pandemic here in BC and globally, of course. So we'll start now with the video of Dr. Maurice Casey on his recorded remarks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Maurice Casey, and I am the historian in residence at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum in Dublin, and the Department of Foreign Affairs. I'm joining you from a lovely area, Dublin, Portobello, not far from the canal. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you all in person in Vancouver. That was originally the plan, but like so many of our plans of the last few years, that plan got diverted because of the latest twist and turn in the ongoing pandemic. Nevertheless, I really wanted to start by thanking Adam Duffy, Frank Flood, Maura de Freitas, and all the team at the Vancouver Consulate for their work on putting this St. Bridget's Day event together. So last year at EPIC in June of 21, we launched a new exhibition out in the world, Ireland's LGBTQ+ diaspora. As the curator of that exhibition, I wanted to give you all an insight into how it came about, what the exhibition is about, and how, now that we're a few months into the exhibition, actually the exhibition just closed here the other week in Dublin. So I wanted to give you an insight into how people have responded to the exhibition and how some of the stories within it have evolved since we opened. So I guess the idea for Out in the World comes out of my own research. So I finished my PhD in history at the University of Oxford in 2020. But my first extended research project, my undergraduate dissertation, was a project about gay activism in the Republic of Ireland in the 70s and the 80s. And after I did that project, I went into a different area, really. I did my PhD on Irish women's activism in the early 20th century. But then after my PhD, I got this brilliant role at EPIC and the DFA. And part of that role was to design an exhibition that could appeal to an Irish diaspora audience. So I returned to that original research that I did during my undergrad, and something that I had noticed in 2015 when I was doing that research, and it was a really exciting time to be doing that research because it was the same year as the marriage equality referendum and that really important vote. But something I really noticed and didn't really have the time to look at in detail was the importance of emigration to those histories, the importance of people simply leaving because they needed a way out of Ireland because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but also the importance of return emigration. So activists going to places like London, New York, or San Francisco and discovering models of community and activism that they then imported back home to Ireland, and which changed the cause, the struggle in Ireland in very dynamic and important ways. So coming to the task then of then designing an exhibition for EPIC, it made natural sense to look at this theme of LGBTQ plus immigration. Of course, when I started at EPIC, it was the summer of 2020, so we were all in lockdown, various kind of forms and levels of severity of lockdown. But it was interesting for me to research this kind of project while in lockdown, and actually I was able to do so. There's a few other projects that I could have done while locked in an attic room in County Tipperary, but this one, because it had so many contemporary stories, this history of LGBTQ plus immigration, that was really easy enough for me to research, given the constraints, not being able to access libraries, archives, and so on. So researching the exhibition, I established a few kind of central pillars of how I was going to curate the stories that we would choose. One of the pillars was that it was not going to be chronological. So it's a thematic exhibition, and the themes are exclusion, community, love, solidarity, defiance, and return. So that thematic approach was very important in terms of fighting back against an idea of linearity. This idea that everything was bad in the past and now everything is good in the future. By placing different stories from different historical periods under the same theme, we could point out commonalities as well as the continuing campaign for a more equal society. Another sort of pillar of the exhibition was diversity in a very broad sense. I don't just mean diversity in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression, but diversity in the sense of chronological, so looking at stories from across the 19th century to the present day. Also looking at diversity in terms of the kind of the color of the stories themselves. So not just looking at histories of activism, but looking at things like, where can we find the LGBTQ plus diaspora stories within the history of religious immigration? So that was another thing that was important to the project. And then I guess a final real kind of pillar of the project was this idea of consent, but using this idea and putting it back through history in a way. So obviously with the stories, the contemporary stories, it was important to be in touch with the family and people presented in those stories. But also when you're thinking about the more historical stories, the early 20th century, the 19th century stories, what was important for me was that I wasn't going to feature anyone whose sexuality or gender identity was betrayed, in a sense, was dug up through a criminal trial, or we know about because of documents they didn't want being made public. So everyone, the source material for everyone in the exhibition enters the historical record on their own terms. They chose to write a memoir, they chose to give an interview, they chose to opt for publication of intimate letters, and so on. So that was another important part of the exhibition. And so it launched in June of 21. And what's been really great is that some of the stories have evolved in ways since. And I'll give you some examples. So under our communities theme, we feature the story of the Brixton Fairies, who were this really interesting gay theatre troupe in the South London district of Brixton during the 1970s and the 1980s. And among that group were a number of Irish gay men. And I visited the exhibition a few weeks after it was up, and we have the stories wall where people can post their own impressions of the exhibition and their own stories. And someone had written a note that said, Frank Egan was my uncle. Frank joined the Brixton Fairies, and I'm proud to follow in his footsteps as an Irish LGBTQ plus person. That note really struck me because here was someone who had come to the exhibition and found the story of this group of which they knew their uncle was a part. So not only finding their own community's history, but their own family history. And so I posted this note on my social media and I asked whoever wrote it to get in touch. And amazingly, Tiernan Arnott Egan, who wrote that note, did get in touch with me. And we had this amazing conversation about learning about that history, learning about how Tiernan came to research it and what they learned on that journey. And we had that conversation over Zoom and we live streamed it. And it was just this amazing, really meaningful moment for me to see how the exhibition itself could be a platform for sharing more stories. Of course, another one that has had, I've kind of had an evolving interaction with the story is Sydney Queer Irish, which are this really dynamic and incredible diaspora group based in Sydney, of course, who do these amazing things around floats and Mardi Gras parade and social activities and campaigning also. And I've been very lucky to also meet Brian and Loretta from Sydney Queer Irish when they came over to Dublin recently. But it's also been great to see how their specific model of a group is transportable. And so in Vancouver, you have Vancouver Queer Irish, which of course draw a lot of inspiration from the work that Sydney Queer Irish have done. So that's been great to see how thinking as a historian, how these models of community travel throughout the diaspora and get taken up elsewhere, and so on. So that's been really cool to see. So I hope that you'll get a chance to see Out in the World. It's closed in Dublin, but I hope now that it seems that we're on the other end, or at least coming through the other end of the Omicron wave, that there'll also be chances for the exhibition to tour, indeed, in Vancouver and further afield, wherever you find yourselves. I hope that you'll be able to see it at an Irish consulate. So that leads me to the next part of my contribution, which is that I wanted to introduce you to Chris Morrissey, who's going to be speaking about her and Bridget Coll's story and their life together. And I thought that I'd introduce you to this story by really talking about how I came to find it and how I came to connect with Chris. So it all started really at the beginning of my research for the exhibition. And what I was doing to research it was to basically find like general survey textbooks, like survey histories of LGBTQ plus change in different countries, and search through them for mentions of an Irish person or mentions of Ireland. And I was looking at one, and I believe it was a history of LGBTQ plus law reform in Canada, when I discovered this little paragraph about how a Canadian woman, Chris Morrissey, had taken a case on behalf of her Irish partner, Bridget Coll. And I became really interested in it. So I typed the two names to Google and I came across this 2015 Vancouver Sun article, which spoke about the two women and their case. And I had these few lines which just sort of captured me completely, where the journalist noted that Chris and Bridget had met in the US, but spent the better part of a decade living and working in Santiago, Chile during the heyday of the Pinochet regime in the 1980s. So that I was quite taken aback by that idea that these two women had met in the US and then had somehow ended up in Chile in the 1980s during an extremely dramatic time and juncture in Chile's history, in the kind of some of the most brutal, but also towards the kind of conclusion of the Pinochet regime in Chile. So as soon as I read that line, I knew that I was going to try and get in touch. And I did so by contacting Rainbow Refugee, which is this fantastic organization that Chris was a founder of, and it helps it helps people seeking refugee protection in Canada on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and HIV status from all over the world to come to Canada. And it's work, of course, that led to Chris being given the Order of Canada in 2019 in recognition for her activism. And so I got in touch with Chris through emailing that organization. And then we spoke over Zoom, the first of a few conversations that we'd have over Zoom. And that's when I learned the whole incredible story of Chris and Bridget and their life and their campaigns together, and how they changed so many lives across the world. So for me, I got to say that it's, I'm not going to get into the details of the story precisely because it's Chris's story to tell, and Chris is such a fantastic storyteller of this particular tale. So I just wanted to really say that how, to really sincerely say how moved I have been by learning about the story of Chris Morrissey and Bridget Coll. And it's sad, of course, that Bridget is no longer with us. It is really meaningful, and I appreciate it greatly, this opportunity to use our exhibition out in the world to be a platform for more people to learn about this story. And I know, speaking, and I've brought so many people through the exhibition now, and I've seen so many people who visited it. For so many people, it's the standout story. For so many people, it's very surprising, but it's also very moving and inspiring and very human. And so I think that I totally agree with those people who say that it's one of the standout stories. It really is. And I hope, and I'm very glad for events like this, and because that's the most meaningful thing you can do as a historian is give greater recognition to people and movements who deserve to be remembered, particularly on a day like St. Bridget's Day. So thank you all. That's everything from me. I see the sun's just come in my window, so I've become extraordinarily bright. So that's kind of a good time for me to log off and to let you all enjoy hearing from Chris. So I hope to see you perhaps in Ireland, perhaps even in Vancouver at some point in the future. See you. Bye, everyone.
Well, thanks a million to Dr. Morris-Casey for that video and that introduction into Chris Morrissey. I just want to say as well that we have so much here to learn about Bridget, but also Chris herself. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris Morrissey now to go through the story of herself and Bridget Coll. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks for this opportunity to be here. And I certainly wish that Bridget were able to be here to tell her own story. But since she's not able to be here, I'm honored and grateful to be able to share her story and our story together. So thanks for this opportunity. And, from what Morris said, it sounds like it's amazing. And, it's one of those things where you just put one foot in front of the other. And that's how we lived our life. So Bridget was born in Fannet Head in Ireland. And her claim to fame always was that her house was the house next to the lighthouse at Fannet Head. And at some point, her father and her nephew in fact, were light keepers in that house before it was automated. One of the things that we always used to tease her about was the photograph of when she was a small child. And she's the 3-year-old there with her finger up her nose. So we always used to give her a hard time about that. That's the first photo we have of her. And the other photo is her at 16, when she, just shortly before she entered the convent. And so through her school years, she had had much contact with the nuns who used to come around collecting money for the missions. And so she herself at some point decided that's what she wanted to do with her life. So I can't let it go by without saying that, you know, as an Irish woman, for sure, she had to go and kiss the Blarney Stone. But really and truly, she was not full of Blarney. She was really someone who was a woman without guile, who was always honest and direct and caring in terms of all of the things that she said and did. So during the years that she was in the convent, when she was in her training, one of the assignments she had was to clean the chapel and take care of the chapel. But within a short time, the novice mistress discovered that she used to leave her fingerprints on the candlesticks, and that would not do. And so instead, they gave her the assignment of the chickens. And so she was to go out to take care of the chickens. And while it wasn't really a punishment, it was certainly thought to be something of, you know, of a come down. But for Bridget, it was a wonderful opportunity to be outside and to spend time outside. I'm also just going to mention at this point that it was through the death of her parents that Bridget and I actually began to develop our own personal relationship. And so that they have been a big part of my life as well. So after she'd finished her training as a sister, she was assigned to go to the United States. And she was in the United States for quite some time. And during that time, most of the work she did was parish work, where she was supporting people, teaching altar boys, things that nuns used to do back in those days. And it was actually during that time that she began to question some of the teachings of the church, in part because she heard so many stories from women and their concern about birth control. And it was around the time that the encyclical of against birth control came out from the Roman Catholic Church. And that was the beginning of her questioning and doubting some of the teachings of the church. So when Bridget entered the convent, she was only 16, and she had not finished her secondary education. And so at some point while in the US, she had always felt sort of that she wasn't good enough because she hadn't actually finished her education. So she actually took up the courage to ask if she could go back to school. So in the US, she went to a program for adult education. And so she finished that, and then she went on to community college, where she got a degree in community service. And in some ways that gave her the courage to take the next step. We had always heard stories from, we had always heard stories from other women who had come back through the States, who'd been working in Chile during the time of the dictatorship. And she had always wanted to go, and as had I. And so she was really scared that she wouldn't be able to learn Spanish, because obviously that's what was needed. We're going to have to speak Spanish. But she decided that she really wanted to be part of this experience. And so she took the risk, and off we went. So that picture that's there is the little wooden house that we lived in. And most of her day-to-day work was very simple and very ordinary. She'd go out in the morning and sweep the street in front of and at the side of our house because of all the dust. And most of the time she spent working with women. In Santiago at the time, women women were definitely seen as second-class citizens. Women did not have the right to inherit money. The men were always the ones who were standing up, doing all the talking, and the women were always in the background doing the cooking and all that kind of stuff. And so she spent a lot of time working with women, helping them come to understand that they also could play an active role. And so she was part of what we did was to start a food co-op that was run by the women and a health team where the women would be available to provide support and first aid to people during the time of the demonstrations and the protests. And so during the time that we were there, the national protests against Pinochet and his regime began. And there were sort of two kinds of protests. There was a national protest, but also in the poblacion areas where we lived, there were also demonstrations that were carried out by a lot of young people in the streets. And so we had the opportunity to, in some cases, we were there in the streets with what we call the fogatas, the burning of tires to keep the militarized police out, and also to provide support to the women who were there sitting in our little hall, there to provide support for anybody who was injured. And there were people who came in and were injured. And so we also participated in the larger national protests where we were actually in downtown Santiago, in the streets with Santiago, and oftentimes were hit by the water cannons that used to come out to dispel the protests. The other thing that happened during that time was that a group of folks, missionaries and Chilean priests, decided that it was time to acknowledge that in Chile there was a torture that was happening. And so they started a small group of people who were going to demonstrate against the torture of the secret police. And over time, different places in Santiago where torture happened were discovered. And one of the places was this place called Borgoño. And so it was decided that our very first movement, the very first protest would be in front of that place. So part of what we had to do was to all gather. We had to sort of wander around the streets, and at 1 o'clock on the spot, one person would go and put themselves in front of the building. And then everybody would then surge and come into that same place. And the demonstration lasted only 3 minutes. And so I remember walking along the street, and Bridget was there walking out front, and she turned around and she said to me, "Hurry up," she said, "it'll be over before we get there." And so she was there pushing me, or pulling me actually along, because for her, it was amazing to me that she had no fear. We used to have this thing between us that she wasn't afraid of the militarized police and I wasn't afraid of the tremors from the earthquakes. So we kind of made a good pair in that way. And because she was short, she always wanted to be at the front. And so there she is holding up a sign that she had made at some demonstration against torture that we were participating in. Another thing that used to happen during that time was what we call allanamientos. So the militarized police would come into a neighborhood, and they would surround the neighborhood, and they would take out all the men and older boys and put them in a field. And then they would go in and they would search the houses, and they were looking for arms and guns and things like that. And so one of the things that we used to do was the missionaries and other people who participated, we used to go to those allanamientos And as the police were surrounding the area, we would surround the police. And we all stood there and we all said the rosary and sang hymns so that it was clear that we were not a threat, so we thought. But one of the things that often happened is that they would ask somebody from our group to go in and to observe that, in fact, they were finding guns there in those houses. And so there was a Chilean priest, Mariano Puga, who was very well known, and he lived not very far from us. And so we were there at this allanamiento, and they called him out to come in and observe. And Bridget yells out, "Don't go, Mariano, you know that they just plant those guns." So she just could not help herself. She couldn't stay quiet. In 1988, there was a plebiscite in Chile, and it had been built into the constitution that Pinochet made. And so there was to be a plebiscite that said, you vote yes or no, whether or not he could continue as the president of the country, of the republic. And he truly believed that he would win. In fact, he didn't. He lost the plebiscite, which was the beginning of the end of the dictatorship in Santiago at the time. So during that time, Bridget and I, who began to talk about what we would do, what our future would look like, because we were clearly together, we were in a relationship, we had spent this time together, and also we came to an awareness that we had spent all that time walking alongside people who were oppressed by a dictatorship. And so we recognized that as lesbians in the Roman Catholic Church, that we were also had experienced that same thing, and that we had been silent and didn't have a voice. And so we decided that it was time for us to begin our own journey of liberation. And this image here is a box that Bridget did for a program that we were a part of. And so we began our own journey to our own liberation. When we came back to, when we decided to come back to Canada, because I was Canadian and my parents were still alive. And so we came back to Canada and began, Bridget got a job supporting adults with developmental disabilities, which is what she had trained for when she went back to school. And then, of course, one of our major journeys was the issue of immigration, because clearly I was Canadian. Bridget at that point had dual Irish and American citizenship. And at that time, the immigration law in Canada only recognized heterosexually married couples in order to be able to have a Canadian sponsor their spouse. And so that didn't include people like us. And so we began to try to figure out how we were going to stay together in Canada. And so we did the various things. We checked out with lawyers and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, we decided that, or we knew that the only thing that we were going to be able to do was to actually file a suit in federal court. And so that's what I did. I ended up filing a suit in federal court against the Queen of Canada and the Minister of Immigration. And that's what the paper says, Chris Morrissey versus the Queen of Canada and the Minister of Immigration. So as a result of that, Canadian immigration never really liked to have precedents set by people going to court. And so they decided that suddenly she qualified for immigration. And so we received a letter one day saying that she had been granted permanent residence. So you can see her in the next picture. When on the morning that we received the letter, that very spontaneously is her response to that. So we had to go down to the border to actually enter Canada. She had to come to the border, enter Canada, and become permanent resident. Now, at that particular time, there was a conference in Vancouver called the All Rights Conference. And so it was a gathering of loads of lesbians and gays at that time who were looking to see what legal things we could do in Canada. So they wanted Bridget and I to come straight from the border and go into that conference and sort of be the headline speakers. Well, we were both terrified that if we went to the border in the morning, that something might happen. So we actually snuck down to the border the night before. And so she got her permanent residence the night before. And in the midst of all this, Pride comes and goes, and every year there are Pride parades. And so we were actually asked and invited to be Grand Marshals for Mondo Pride, which happened in 1985. And so I don't know that you can see very well, but there's Bridget carrying the Irish flag, and I think I have the Canadian flag. One of the challenges, though, was that the fact that when we initiated our challenge, our intention was to get the legislation changed. And because immigration decided to sidestep our legal filing our legal suit and going to court, they sidestepped that. It meant that the law never got changed. And so we knew that what we wanted to do was to make sure that the law in Canada was actually changed, not just for us, but for other people like us. And we had learned from our experience in Santiago that one of the ways that you do that is to gather a group of people together and begin to organize. And so that's what we did. We formed an organization called Legit, which is the Lesbian and Gay Immigration Task Force, now called Same-Sex Immigration, Canadian Immigration for Same-Sex Partners. And so Bridget would often be at tables, we'd be providing information. And there we were again, back into the streets, only this time during the Pride parades. And you can see Bridget there in both of those images right behind the banner, carrying the banner for Legit, and then later on in another Pride parade, excuse me, carrying the banner for Rainbow Refugee. And eventually, throughout all of this process, she finally became an American citizen. And life went on. We continued to do the information sessions, and with our small group, we wrote briefs that we met with every Minister of Immigration along the way to try and get the legislation changed. And eventually in 2002, there was a new Immigration Act was introduced. And in fact, the legislation was changed. And so now the definition is that a Canadian can sponsor someone with whom they are in a committed relationship. And so now it's possible for Canadians who have same-sex partners from other parts of the world to actually be able to sponsor them to become residents of Canada. As time went on, we began to notice that Bridget was having difficulties with her memory. And so eventually she was diagnosed with dementia. And we were approached by Extra, which was the newspaper, the queer newspaper of the time, to see if she would be willing to do an interview. And her words were, "If it will help someone else, I'm happy to be part of that." And so again, we were involved with the media and a story about what it's like to be in a same-sex relationship and to be a couple where one person has developed dementia. And so that was an additional contribution that I think that she made by her willingness to be out there, to be visible, and to hopefully provide some hope, or at least for people to know that in fact we're not alone in this struggle. So that's more or less her journey in terms of her life. But there also, I mean, clearly she was quite the rebel. I remember one day she told me, we were getting off the bus in Santiago, and one day she said to me, you know what she said, what I did? She said that a carabinero, one of the police officers, got off the bus in front of her, and she says to me, I kicked his heel on the way off the bus. So she just couldn't resist. And there was her rebellious nature, and also her courage and her willingness to take stuff on. But as a human being, she was, as well as that, she was nurturing. She loved her garden. Wherever we went, she planted gardens. And we were both adopted grandmas for a baby of a lesbian couple. And she loved Colleen and spent many hours with her. The other thing that she would do when she participated in other community-based events, not in the queer community, but in the general larger community, she was always looking for opportunities to raise awareness. And so one day she was visiting a residential care facility, and they had a declaration of their diversity. And she went and she had a look, and there was no mention of sexual orientation or gender identity. And so she made it her business to actually go and find the woman who was in charge of the facility and say, this is a statement of diversity, but I don't see myself here. And so, you know, she continued in her own small way to actually continue to raise awareness of the necessity to be included in and to be visible. The other thing that she also had a side that was fun, a fun side to her. And so here you see her, we were on a camping trip, and that's Colleen, our granddaughter, and Bridget was brushing her teeth outside, and Colleen was looking. She couldn't figure out because she didn't know how to spit. And so there was Bridget deciding to give Colleen lessons about how she could spit. Another thing that she did when we were in Santiago, we used to have gatherings of a few of us, and she decided that for some reason or other, and I don't remember the circumstances, but that she was going to dress up as Mother Teresa. And so she dressed up as Mother Teresa using a flour sack and what other kinds of stuff. Because the thing is that Mother Teresa had been to visit Santiago at some point and had a meeting with Pinochet. And none of us were very happy about the fact that Mother Teresa had arrived in Santiago. And so she was there. She was there pontificating about Mother Teresa. And we also have had the opportunity to take vacation in Mexico. And one of the things, we were in Mexico, and there were 4 adults, and of the 4 adults, Bridget was the only one who was willing to do this paragliding over the ocean. So she was, you know, she had that adventurous streak as well. She was very proud of being able to do that. And just in terms of her own family, one of her sisters got married. And if you take a look at this picture, those are all her siblings that were living at the time, her brother and her various sisters. And if you notice, Bridget's in the middle, and she's the only one without a hat. And the only one who's, well, I guess her other one sister there is not wearing a skirt. So, you know, in very small ways, she continued to be visible and out there, always out front, often very quietly creating waves, I guess, is what you can say, right? So that was Bridget. That was her life, and I very obviously loved her, and we loved each other, and we had many happy years together. And I felt very blessed to have her in my life. And this next coming month, February, is the 6th anniversary of her death, and I miss her every day. So thanks for this opportunity to share her with many other people. She's worth sharing. Her story is worth sharing. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. It's an amazing story that covers so many countries, so many historic events, and it just, I think, it's a really good indication of how much impact an individual can have in this world. So there's a Q&A session now. So if anybody has any questions, please just fire them into the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen on Zoom. It'd be great to have a few questions to chat back and forth. One thing I would say myself is I thought it's very interesting how Bridget herself aligns with this festival in terms of the kind of similarities with the story of Bridget and Saint Bridget, in that there was a Christian aspect, Catholic aspect, and then there's kind of a more rebellious aspect as well, which is I think, the parallels there, I think, work so well. And in terms of Bridget as an avatar for the power of women, I think Bridget Coll herself is an avatar for the power of women and the power of queer people. And to think of how much that can be achieved when we, as you would put, so like Chris, that we decide not to be silent anymore and to recognize the difficulties that we face and that they don't change unless we speak up. Thanks for that. So there's a question in from Cynthia Coll, who asks, Chris, perhaps you could say a few words about Bridget's writing with quirk. Quirky.
So yeah, so Quirky is the queer imaging and writing collective for elders that we have here in Vancouver. And Bridget was a member of that, and she spent, we used to meet every week, and she wrote stories about her life and her memoir, which I still have all those pieces of writing, some in her handwriting and some that I typed out for her. And so it was a way for her to actually express herself. And when I invited her to come, she said, I'm not a writer. I said, but you're a storyteller. So, and she was a great storyteller. And so in Quirky, she actually was able to write down some of her, a lot of her stories, right?
Okay. And there's another question here from Patricia Hogan, who asks, how did Bridget's family react to her in leaving the convent and being in a relationship with the woman?
Well, that was a part that Bridget was always quite anxious about and nervous about, because, coming from an Irish family and having entered the convent, her family was very, at that point, was very Catholic. And so she was actually quite anxious and quite nervous about leaving. But over time, she did come out to them, and she and I visited them. I went with her a couple of times, visited one of her sisters in London, and we were very clear that we were in a relationship, and her sister was fine with that. And then later on, I actually went with her to Letterkenny and to Fanet, where Bridget is from, and spent time with her with that sister, and also with her sister and her brother. And I don't know how it happened, but they accepted her and they accepted us as a couple. So I guess maybe the power of love is what won them over. I'm not quite sure. And I also think that that many people in Ireland, including her siblings, also had questions about the church and the teachings of the church around issues that affected their lives. And so I'm sure that had an impact as well on their ability to accept us, because I'm sure they also had been questioning some of the church's teachings.
Peggy says, thank you so much for sharing your such a beautiful story. She's wondering about your relationship with the church, what it was when you left and what it became as you lived your lives together.
So thanks for that. It's a very complicated question. But, you know, we went from living in New York State where we had already begun to make transition in the 70s in terms of what was happening to religious women and the changes that we were beginning to make. And then we went to Santiago. And in Santiago, because of where we lived and because of how the church operated in the poor sections, we operated as a basic Christian communities. And so our church experience was extremely different, nothing like we had ever lived before. And so we would have gatherings with other people from the community, and we would talk about the scripture, and we talk about how what's written in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, how in fact we lived that out and what our lives were like. And for people who know Catholic tradition, there was Mass once a month. And so we would have in a small hall, we would have Mass once a month. And so we began to, our understanding of church and religion and spirituality began to shift and change. And it became much more about how we live our lives. So when it came time to come back to Canada, we had lived that way for so long that there was no way that we could go back to the traditional church. And we did go to a parish church once, and we left because we just could not manage to sit through the priest standing up and telling us all of these things that again we experienced as oppressive. And so in fact, we don't have a relationship, any formal relationship with the church. We didn't when Bridget died, and we still don't, I still don't. So it was an evolutionary process for sure.
There's a question here about the habit. When did you stop wearing the nun's clothing, and where were you at that time? What difficulties did you have transitioning to lay clothing? I think the questioner missed a pun there. When did you kick the habit?
Well, we were in different places when the changes began. Bridget was in the US, and I happened to be in Brunei teaching when we began to make those changes. And so I remember for me, the day that I walked out of the convent and into the classroom, it was like I was holding my breath, not knowing how the girls in my class were going to respond and react. So, you know, it was another kind of coming out in a way, right? Having to do that. And then when I eventually went back to the US and we were using street clothing, but we still wore a veil. You saw in that picture of Bridget where she's wearing a blue veil. And I remember at some point we decided to not wear that veil and to just have ordinary street clothing. This was in the 70s. And I remember our superior general coming once to meet us, and she said, "I hope you don't represent the congregation wearing trousers." And I was wearing a pantsuit at the time. So, you know, again, it was a process of evolution. And when we went to Santiago, there was no question. We wore blue jeans and t-shirts. We needed to wear things that were not setting us aside and setting us apart from the people with whom we were living and working. So again, another sort of process that we had to go through. So, and we did kick the habit.
Yeah. Thanks for completing my punchline. There's a question in here from Anonymous. What a beautiful, touching story. Could you tell us a bit more about the complicity of the Catholic Church with the Pinochet regime?
Well, that's a little bit complicated in the sense that, as I mentioned, Mother Teresa was there, and she was there on behalf of her congregation. And what she was wanting from the regime was land so that she could set up an orphanage. In Santiago, and I can only really speak about Santiago because that's where we spent all our time. The Cardinal of Santiago was in one of those situations where he recognized that that there was oppression, that people were being oppressed, that there was torture, that there were people who were detained and disappeared, and in fact began a program or an office that was called the Vicaría de Solidaridad. And that's where people who had been detained or family members had been detained would go, and there would be lawyers who would help them. And that was actually set up and started by the Cardinal of Santiago. So again, you know, I think kind of very, very mixed, sort of walking a tightrope in a way. Did recognize and did support people whose human rights had been violated, but at the same time was not particularly outspoken politically.
There's a question in from Emma about, she would love to know if your story and Bridget's story might be preserved for the future and future generations, perhaps records within the Alot archives. But I believe that's kind of covered under, well, her writings with Quirky, the interviews that she's done, as well as Morris's Out in the World exhibition.
Yes, and also Bridget did recordings that for a program that in fact are archived at Simon Fraser University. Mm-hmm. So there are records that exist there. I'm constantly being suggested that I write a book, but I'm not so sure about that. But I think there certainly are plenty of places where we've done interviews and that has been preserved. And also, I don't know if it's still there, but I do remember that we were approached by the Museum of Human Rights in Canada, and I was interviewed, and our story in terms of the immigration story was recorded for the Museum of Human Rights in Canada.
One in from Janice here says, thanks you for sharing Bridget's story as well as your own. Those of us who met her are very fortunate. Around what year was it that Bridget came out to her family?
Well, we went back. We'd already been in Santiago, I think, when we went back, because one of the things so it would have been, all of this happened in the early 80s, early to mid 80s, that she actually sort of came out to her family. Because she didn't come out and say, I'm a lesbian. I don't think I ever heard her say that to her family. In fact, in the beginning, in the early days of our relationship, she would say, no, I'm just in love with a woman. I'm not a lesbian. But over time, clearly, she identified as a lesbian and recognized that because of our sexual orientation, that it wasn't just that she loved a woman, that she in fact was part of a group of people that were oppressed, and so she took that on. So again, a sort of a process. We went to visit them. We stayed with her sister, when her sister lived in London, was the first time I remember. And I remember that because we had been in Santiago, and when we were in London, suddenly there was a helicopter overhead, and it really triggered me because one of the things that happened during the regime was that they would fly in helicopters, and they would shoot from helicopters when there were protests. And so I remember that being triggered by that. So I know that experience was sort of in the was after the protests began. So it was kind of mid-80s.
Question in from Kathleen Sharp, who asks, would the nuns run the monthly masses in Santiago, or were priests still in charge there?
It was a priest, certainly, who did that. On the other hand, at the same time, when we had our women's groups and we would have the women come together, we ourselves always had rituals. And so there was another alternative to the Mass, because many people, I mean, we didn't go to church. I remember the Superior General came to visit, and when she was there, she asked us where the parish church was so that she could go to Mass on Sunday. We had no clue. We did not know where the church was, because our experience always was to go down to the little hall and gather with the community once a month. But in addition to that, we did hold our own rituals that were quite different. You know, we would use breaking of the bread. We also use things like water and soil and, you know, things that helped us express our lives in symbols. So we weren't saying Mass, but we were breaking bread.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think Mass can be in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
Absolutely.
So I think we will check this last one there. So we have one last question, and then we'll call it. We're just about over time, and we'll do a few closing remarks. But from Della Ratcliffe, she asks, well, first she says, thank you for sharing the extraordinary story of you and Bridget and how you supported others. How was it for you with your family? Did they embrace the changes that you made?
When we came back to Canada, I came out to my brother first, one of my brothers, and I said to him, what do you think if I tell Mom and Dad? And he said to me, that'll be another nail in the old man's coffin. So I did not come out to my parents at that time, but after my father died, I came out to my mother. And I wasn't quite sure how that would go, but one day I took to her and gave her a book called Lesbian Daughters. And then I remember when I went back to visit her, you know, to her house on occasion, the book was actually on the coffee table. So, I mean, she always treated Bridget like a daughter. Yeah, Bridget became part of our family in the same way. So my mom embraced her. And when I came out to her, my mom said, I must have been very sheltered because I don't know anybody like that. And I said, oh, Mom, yes, you do. Remember so-and-so in Prince George? No, she said. I said, yes, Mom.
Right, well, sorry, that's me hitting the wrong buttons. So I think we will wrap it up there. Thanks a million to everybody who attended today and was able to stay through to the end. I just want to flag that we have more events on tomorrow. We have the BridgetFestivalVancouver.com to check out that and to register. So a couple of very exciting events, in particular the Records and Redress event that is going to look at both the Indian Residential School and the Mother and Baby institutions on the matters of records and redress. But for today, I would love to thank Morris Casey for providing the recorded remarks that we heard earlier today, and also for bringing this story to the attention of many of us through the Out in the World exhibition. To Chris Morrissey herself for speaking with us here today and sharing these stories, and for answering all the questions put to her. I would also like to thank the consulate, which is myself and Frank and Blahin and Camilla, our team here, for being able to run this event, as well as the Bridget Festival of Vancouver, whose event this is, of course, in particular, Maura DeFreitas and Mary McSweeney, who was our tech event coordinator for today. And then lastly, I would like to thank the sponsors of the Bridget Festival Vancouver as well for all of their support. A survey has just been shared into the chat function. It will also be available online on social media and will be mailed out to all participants who have registered. We would love to get your feedback on the survey to let us know what you enjoyed about the festival or what could be improved or any other comments you may have. One lucky respondent from the survey will win a print from a local Irish artist, Deirdre Keohane. So do make sure that you respond to that survey and put your name in the running. So I think with that, we will leave it there. Thank you very much again to everybody who has attended. And please do check out the Bridget Festival website. The recording of this event will be shared in the coming days on that website, so you can share it around further. Thank you very much.